So today I do want to teach you a little bit about list comprehensions and comprehensions in general and the walrus operator. And I do think that the best way to learn something is, first of all, teach it to somebody else, which is what I'm doing. So it's all for me to actually make me learn about this. But it's also try to use these things in the worst possible ways. Because sooner or later, you'll always meet some kind of edge case which you didn't expect. And if you just abuse everything early on, you will get all the edge cases, and you will be able to actually use it from that point and on. So let's start immediately with the walrus operator. So if you don't know, but you should, the walrus operator allows you to set a variable value within an expression. And I do have here somewhere Carlo, which is of whose Pythonic skills are unmatched. However, when it was first introduced, I managed to find an example which totally confused it, because sometimes it's easy to understand incorrectly which is the order of executions of various expressions, and you just mess up the walrus operator entirely. So let's immediately jump into order of evaluations, because it's really important. And a couple of notes. First of all, that first thing allows you to, the first line is just print, but it actually prints a value just before actually having the function entirely. The second line is just true, but when it gets executed, it will print A. And this allows us to kind of understand which, what is being executed and what isn't. And the other couple of things you should know, like these are comprehensions. So first of all, first example, this is a list comprehension with, on the first lines, ternary operator, and then a function called write at the end, and each step has a print value. So the question is, what is going to be executed first, and in what order? So which numbers are we actually going to see on the screen in what order? So I'm actually going to give you like 30 seconds to think about this, to read it. If this was a YouTube video, I would say stop the video and think it's 30 seconds just to see what's going on. And then you can raise your hand and try to give the solution. Somebody wants to try to give away the order of operations here? What am I going to see? What numbers am I going to see in what order? That's the question.
4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 1.
Exactly. 4, 5, 6, 2, 1. And why is that? So firstly, the outermost element is a list comprehension. So we want to know what we're actually iterating on, which is that print 4 inside of square brackets. Then we check the condition, which is the last thing. And we first do the function to be called, so print 5, and then we do the arguments, which is print 6. And then we go all the way back to the ternary operator. We do the condition first, which is the 2, and then since not print is true, we just get to the print 1, and the print 3 never actually gets executed. So this is the order. Why is it important to know this? Because these are some mistakes that I've seen around, which is exactly what we just saw, but using the walrus operator in the wrong order. In both cases, we get exception because num is not defined. And that is because we define it later than we actually use it. And visually, it seems correct because we first assign the value on the leftmost element, and then we use it on the right. But sometimes we execute parts of things on the right before the things on the left. So these are incorrect, and to fix them, you just have to move where you actually define num and so on. So what's the next slide, because I completely forgot? OK, so let's now dive into a terrible idea, which I had whilst doing this presentation. and that is try to make this work. So we've got a function which is defined as an argument of itself. So I first define function which is print, and then I try to call it giving itself as an argument. Why would I do this? We don't care right now. Just let's try to do this. Does this work? Somebody can tell me whether this works or not, just if you type this line into Python.
I think it doesn't.
Why doesn't it?
Scopes, but I'm not sure about it.
It's not actually about scopes, which I originally thought I was going to talk about, but turns out not a big deal. There's something else which is bigger, which is the order of operation. We always first execute the function to be called, and then the arguments. So in this case, function, the leftmost one, is executed first, and it immediately raises an error because it's not defined, because it's an argument. But we can fix that. So we can use a kind of a trick, which we shouldn't use. There's no reason to, but we can make this work. So again, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think this through, and then I'm sure there are many solutions, but just try to pick one. Ideas? Shall I give you a hint?
Parentheses, function was equal print, close, open, function.
Okay. Yes, that would be defining the function directly as yes to be called. But I do actually want this to work. So I do want to define a function in the arguments and then be able to call it. So I'll give you a hint. So what could it be? This is just one solution. I'm sure there are many. Any ideas? Hands up. Nice. So this is my solution. I'm just going to wrap the first element inside of a lambda. So what this does is Python first asks, OK, do I have the function that I actually want to call? And in the previous case, it said, no, there isn't any. And that immediately gave an error. In this case, there's a lambda, and Python is just happy to know that there is a lambda. It's only when the function actually gets called, which is the last thing, that Python actually executes the things inside of the lambda, and in that case, function will be defined. So this works, and lambda in general are very, very useful to actually postpone when you want something to be executed, and if you have to bind something and then change the value, and you want a function to refer to the new value, you just put it inside of a lambda and execute it when you know that you have the correct value. So this is just one thing. And again, what's the next slide? Yes, of course, there's a big question here, which I'm totally ignoring, which is why would you care about all of this? And you shouldn't. But again, I do think that there are some corner cases that it might be good to know for the future. As an example, this is a function that is recursive, and it's also defined directly in one line. So I'm defining the usual function, and then I'm giving it a name, as you were saying previously, and then I'm passing it as an argument of the function itself. So in just one line, I'm able to do a recursive inline function. You shouldn't do this, ever, but you know. Still talking about how you can get the walrus operator wrong. This is a question from Stack Overflow, and this is somebody complaining that the first two lines are the same. It's just changing the value it's comparing. The first one works, the second one doesn't. They look the same, and so this person rightfully says this looks completely inconsistent. Again, he messed up the order of executions of things. So again, can you spot which is the mistake here? What's happening? Why does the second line not work? Yes?
Y is not yet defined.
Yes, that's what it says. And but why is it not? I mean, why isn't it defined? Like, we do have a definition. Okay, come on. We do have a definition there of y, and the comparison fails, and thus.
Skips to the next part.
Yes. So basically, it does first the x part, which is 1. It checks whether 1 is strictly less than 1. It isn't. So it doesn't even bother to go on and actually define y. So it immediately raises an error. And now I've just slightly changed, yet again, to show how subtle these errors can be. Is this going to work? It's almost the same. I just changed one little detail. Is this going to work? I'm going to give you the answer. It does work, because same issue as before, except that now I do use the same variable on both lines, which means that on the second line, it's still defined from the first line. So it does work. It shouldn't. You might think that everything works if this works, but there's actually a big error there, because z is not going to actually get the correct value. Now, one last order. This is too boring. I don't have time for it. So switching to comprehensions, there are some good ones, the bad ones. The good ones is kind of what you would expect. These are comprehensions. I'm just assuming that you kind of know what they are. And they are almost perfectly consistent, except that the last one, if you use the tuple syntax, you would expect the value to be a tuple. It isn't. It's actually a generator. And I'm not going to get into what that means, but as a rough way to explain it, a very bad one. If you know iter, then generator is basically doing just list comprehension and then just throwing iter at it. Slight differences, but we don't really care about them. The main point is that the generators are lazy. And what that means is that when you actually write that code, and you run it, even if you have prints inside of it, nothing is actually going to get executed until you actually start iterating on the generator, which means that in a list comprehension, that one last line would print hi 10 times. This one doesn't. It doesn't do anything until you start iterating on it, which brings me to my proudest trick of this whole talk. No, not yet. I just wanted to point this out. Again, I think you kind of know about this, but if you just throw a comprehension inside as an argument of a function call, it's the same thing as if you were just doing the generator and passing that as an argument, which means you can just use generators inside of sums as an example. It might help to clean the code. In general, if you have inside of an argument a list comprehension, most of the times you can just throw away the square brackets and it's still gonna work anyway. So that shouldn't be an issue. But yeah, it's a nice thing that you should probably know about. Now the trick. So this is better trick. So there's a line missing at the top that actually defines my list. So we don't know what my list is. The rest of it is pretty simple. I just set a variable, answer. I iterate over a list, or over my list, whilst doing absolutely nothing. And just by doing that, my value of answer has changed. How could that happen? And the most Pythonist people most experienced with Python would think of like setting a custom iter method of a class, and then that one can try to modify the global variables. It's much simpler than that. So yet again, I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think this through and try to find a possible value for my list. That's very simple, like it's 27 character long, so very short, and yet it manages to mess up with my global variables, even if I'm not doing anything with it. What could it be?
A generator expression comprehension with a walrus operator in it?
Yes. So it's just that. So I've got a generator, which is lazy, again, so it doesn't get immediately executed, which means that the variable is not going to be set until I actually start iterating on my list. And as soon as I do that, the global variables change. And this is kind of a big deal because I'm able to write something in a very simple way that behaves in a way that you would never expect. If you start iterating on a variable, anything, and you just not do anything with it, you wouldn't expect your global variables to change, but you can, in a very simple way. Don't ever do this, by the way. And if you do this, don't absolutely say, I told you about this. I didn't. But now we get to things that are not as tricky, but I still get them wrong. So this is nested comprehensions. So a comprehension is inside of a comprehension. And the thing is that you would expect that stuff like this basically behaves the same. Just to say it very quickly. Of course, the first one is going to get you a list of lists, whereas the second one is just going to give you one list. Thing is, when you do this, the order, again, is actually inverted. So in the second case, for value in row, for row in column, that's going to throw an exception because you first do for value in row, and then you do for row in column, and row is undefined. Whereas in the first line, which looks basically the same, that won't actually work because it first does for row in column, and then it goes back to for value in row. So as a general rule, nested comprehensions, right to left, not nested left to right, as you would normally expect. How much time do I have left? Time out?
40 seconds.
40 seconds. I don't know what to do with them. Yes, that was kind of everything, but if you feel like you want to spend the 30 seconds in a good way, you can try to figure out what's the value of this and what's the value of A as soon as this finished. It's not easy.
Okay, so a big wave for Niccolò. We have 5 minutes for questions. You can use a Slido just like we did with Samantha. So, while I open Slido, you can explain just this one?
Yes, so basically we start from the top, we go to the bottom. So A is 5, which is true, so we get to the line under it, which sets it to 0. Which is false, so we get to the line underneath, which raises by 1, so it's 1. And this is true, so it goes to the line after that, which gets to 2, which is still true, so I still get to the line under it. 2 minus 2 is 0, which is false, so it ends there, and you have that the value of the whole thing is 0, whereas A is still 2 because I don't set the new value.
Great, so we have for now one question. Why should we use list comprehension? Is it useful to improve the performance of code?
Oh, I guess I should have talked about that, I guess. Yeah, no.
Oh, We have 3 minutes.
We have 3 minutes. So now, I'm not sure about the performance. I do think that it helps a lot to improve the readability of the code, being able to actually better understand what's going on. It really depends on the use case. So if you've got like nested comprehensions, then you probably want to avoid that and just go with normal loops. But if you just have one for loop that you could just replace in one line with a comprehension, it could be easier to read. This is all trying to make it harder than it seems, because if you want to use a lot of comprehensions, then it is also worth noticing that sometimes you're dealing with some weird programs that only accept expressions and not statements. So sometimes you do have to write just one line of code to do something. Maybe you're working with some modding of some games and it just accepts one command and it has to be an expression. In that case, you have to use expressions, you have to use comprehensions and such.
Great talk. Another question, but that's a great wave again for you. Great talk. I loved it.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Niccolò.